Let's talk about two more types of columns that you can add from within the query editor: index columns and conditional columns. So starting with index columns, you'll find the option right here in the Add Column menu. And basically what an index column is it's a list of sequential values that uniquely identify each individual row of a table. Typically, these start from 0 or 1, and they're most frequently used to create unique keys or IDs that can be used to form relationships with other tables. And I know we've been kind of hinting at this idea for quite a bit, and it's something that's going to be covered in much more depth in the Intro to Data Modeling section of this course. So index columns, they're super simple. Moving on to conditional columns, these are a bit more interesting. And you can find them right there above the index column option in the Add Column tab. And basically, these allow you to define new fields based on logical rules or if-then conditions. So the example we're going to be walking through is to create a new conditional column that we're naming quantity type. And the way that we're going to define quantity type is a function of the order quantity column. So we can tell Power BI for any row in our table where the order quantity equals 1, I want to set my quantity type equal to single item. If my order quantity is greater than 1, I want to set my quantity type to multiple items. And then you always have this catch-all value if false. So that's basically the value that you want your column to take in the case that all of the rows or line items above are false. So Power BI is going to go through and cycle through each of these rows from top to bottom. And if none of the conditions are met, then that otherwise statement is the value that's returned. All right, so let's open up our AdventureWorks report and we'll see what this looks like in the query editor. All right, so at this point in the course, we're getting pretty close to having all of our tables loaded. And in this lecture, we're going to start working with our sales data. So first thing that I want to do here is this query view here is getting a little bit cluttered for me. So I actually want to group together a bunch of these queries that we have disabled load for. All right, so I'm going to select all of these queries. If I right click, move to group, and then create a new group here. I'm just going to call these demo queries. All right, we'll click OK. And basically what this does is it creates a folder structure within your query pane here. And again, it just really cleans this up. So now we can see exactly the live queries here that we're working with. All of these other ones are still accessible, and we could manage these and mess with them at a later date. But again, this kind of cleans things up. All right, so we're going to make sure that we have our other queries folder selected here, and then we're going to connect to our sales data. Right, and for this example, let's use the 2022 sales data. All right, our data preview looks great. It's pretty simple here, right? We've got order and stock dates, order number, some key columns, and then order and order quantity. All right, so we'll add this into our query editor. All right, the table is added in our other queries folder here. And again, let's follow those kind of first two steps, right? We'll check out these column headers: order date, stock date, order number. We've got date, a text field. Our key columns are set up as whole numbers, which look great. And then same thing with our order and order quantity values. All right, the next thing that I want to do is we will update our name, right, to sales data 2022. And one thing to mention here is I'm specifically not adding in that lookup identifier here because this is a different type of table, right? This is something called a fact table, not a lookup table. And we're going to explain exactly what that means in the data modeling section of this course. But to give you a quick teaser, essentially we're looking at order quantities and order line items here with keys that allow us to map those orders to things like our territories, to customers, to products, to our calendar table. And you see here, if I scroll over to dates, right, we've got some different date fields that we can use to tie to that calendar lookup table. So no need to really dive any deeper than that quite yet. Just put this in the back of your head because it'll come into play in the next section of the course. All right, so at this point, why don't we go ahead and practice adding an index column? So we're going to come up to our Add Column menu, Index Column, and you can see from here we have some options. We can start from 0 or 1. Maybe you've got some sort of crazy business use case where you need to start from a different custom number. Again, you can specify that and with a specific increment as well. Generally, I like to start from 1. And perfect. You see here, we've got a new applied step for add index column. So let's say that we want to see this at the start of our data set, right? You can click a column header here and you can drag it. The other thing that you could do to be a little bit more efficient is you could right click, come down to move, and then move this column to the beginning of the table, right? So now we've got our index column here. We've reordered the column, so we've got another applied step there as well. All right, so far so good. And, and maybe this column is something like an order ID that we want to use to kind of track each individual order, in which case we could rename the column. But to be honest, we don't need this ID or key column here. In fact, it actually might just complicate and confuse things down the road. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and delete this. Now, what's interesting here is I've basically landed exactly where I started. This is the table in its original kind of untouched form, right? All the same columns that we started with and that we imported, right? But one of the things that you'll notice here is that I've actually got 6 different applied steps now. And what's happened is when we removed the column, it didn't delete these other applied steps. So if I click back to the add index column applied step, you can see that it's actually still here. So the implications of this are that each time we refresh this data set or we add more data to it or like something changes, Power BI is going to run through all of these different applied steps. And that means adding the index column, reordering the column, and then deleting it, right? And that's just, honestly a little bit silly and redundant, and it isn't efficient at all. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete these last 3 applied steps to remove that add index column work, right? And now we're back to our original data set with our original 3 applied steps. So again, this is just kind of an important nuance to keep in mind, and it's just a good demonstration of how these applied steps are actually working. All right, now our last little demo here, I want to create a conditional column, and it's right there above that index column step. And we get our dialog box that opens here. And so first things first, let's call this quantity type, right? And then we have our different inputs here for the conditional statement. And like we saw in our slides, we're going to base this on our order quantity. And we want to set this when it equals to 1. We want that output to equal single item. Click add clause to add an additional case here. So if our order quantity equals 1, then single item. Otherwise, or else if order quantity is greater than 1, we want to return multiple items, right? So at this point, we're going to be all set for our conditional column, but in cases where you have more complex logic, you can continue to add new clauses here, right, to create additional else if statements for part of that conditional logic. In this case, what we have here is a fully comprehensive and mutually exclusive list of conditions. We don't really have any other rows in our table here with an order quantity of 0, and I sure hope we don't have any rows with a quantity of a negative value. So that really leaves us with just 2 possible options. You've either ordered one thing or you've ordered more than one thing. So that said, as a best practice, I always like to have an else clause. All right, so if either of these 2 conditions aren't met, we're going to say else other, right? And again, this is just a great kind of catch-all, in case something really strange or weird or unanticipated happens within the data set, we're covered. We'll be able to flag that. So click OK. All right, and you can see here in the quantity type column that we're getting our values of multiple and single returned. We can click the column header here, and we can see multiple item and single item. One thing to notice here is that you've got this kind of warning flag here where it says list may be incomplete. What's happening here is that when you see this flag, it's just Power BI telling you that, hey, I only looked at a sample of rows within the column in order to produce this list above. And this is really just Power BI's way of saving some memory and processing power. But if you want Power BI to check the entire contents of the column, click Load More. And that kind of forces Power BI to scan all of the values within the column instead of just a preview. All right, so this confirms that we have just 2 quantity types, multiple and single. So from here, we'll click OK. And that's just about all we need to do here. So we'll head back to our home tab. We'll click close and apply, and then we'll make sure to save this workbook. All right, so we've got our sales data 2022 loaded into our model, and we'll keep moving on.